Alright, I oh so subtly dropped hints as to what my next project was going to be, and a lot of you guessed, and yep, it was Peanuts, specifically the 50 television specials. So I do want to be clear that that's all I'll be talking about in this series. I won't be taking a look at the movies, the other TV shows like the Charlie Brown and Snoopy Show, or the This Is America Charlie Brown miniseries. Just the individual standalone specials, starting with a Charlie Brown Christmas back in 1965, all the way to One of a Kind Marcy that was released last August. And I'll also be very briefly taking a look at the documentary A Boy Named Charlie Brown. Like a lot of people, I grew up with Peanuts, watching the specials, particularly the holiday ones, but of course I hadn't seen all of them. And it'll be interesting to watch these, try to explain why some of these classics from my childhood really are the best. And while I'm at it, maybe I'll come across a few hidden gems that I'd never seen before, and maybe introduce you to one or two of them as well. This should be an interesting journey, and I can't wait to go through them. But before we get started, as always, a quick thank you to my patrons over on Patreon, and a special shout out to my newest patron, Adam Morrow. Thank you so much for your support. And if you enjoy the content I make and would like to offer your support, then for as little as $1 a month, you can get your name listed right here at the start of every video. Link to that is in the description below. Alright, let's waste no more time and just get into it. A Boy Named Charlie Brown. No, I'm not talking about the feature-length film released in 1969, I'm talking about the 26-minute-long documentary made in 1963 that actually predates A Charlie Brown Christmas. Now, I was wondering whether or not I should even include this one at all. It's not technically a Peanuts special, it doesn't really have a story like the other ones do, in fact, it never even made it on the air at all, but I did manage to find a copy on the internet, so I decided, what the heck? Because when else am I ever going to get a chance to talk about this? Plus, I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at what could only be described as a time capsule for early 60s Peanuts. This documentary short marked the very first time that the Peanuts characters were animated for the purposes of audience entertainment, and not merely to sell a product like for a commercial. Mostly. Now, the animated segments are very brief. I think it only makes up about 2 minutes of screen time. And in fact, usually the characters are expressed with still frame images, which isn't a complaint. I understand that animation was expensive, so they had to limit the actual amount of animation. Besides, the animation isn't really the focus. The focus of this documentary is to examine Peanuts as a comic strip, its characters, and its legacy. Now, for the most part, there's not a ton of information about the Peanuts gang in here that anybody who hasn't experienced these characters wouldn't already know. It's largely surface-level examinations about the characters. But what makes this one worth a watch is the segments in which Charles Schulz is being interviewed. I think it's nice to look back and remember, oh yeah, these iconic and classic characters were actually created by a human being, and even how similar he is in some ways to Charlie Brown. And there are some moments where we get a look at Charles Schulz's thought process on the strip, at least at the time. We get to see his studio, we get to watch him draw some sketches, we get to listen to what he thinks about certain characters, and we get to watch him respond to fan mail, including one person who threatened to become a monk if Charlie Brown didn't get a Joe Slobotnik baseball card. And Schulz responded by telling him to start looking for monasteries. So nice to see how fan and creator interactions have actually changed very little over the years. But the most poignant moment, for me at least, was him being self-reflective and thinking about how the success of Peanuts adds extra pressure on him. Since now, if it fails, or if a joke falls flat, he feels like he's letting all of his fans down. I think a lot of people, especially a lot of creators, can relate to this kind of anxiety, this feeling that comes with any level of success. But I think seeing even the creator of a juggernaut property like Peanuts struggling with these thoughts of insecurity is strangely comforting in a way, because it shows that these feelings are normal and they can be overcome. You just have to push through it. And then there's just some moments where the documentary crew has a little bit of fun with it, like acting like the 60s Giants baseball team might get one of their players traded over to Charlie Brown's team. Then they actually get players of the team to react to this news like it's real, and how awful of a manager Charlie Brown is, and how they'd rather quit baseball than play for him. And I love the bit where they actually really did have a Charlie Brown Day at one of the Giants games so that fans could show support and appreciation for him. And of course, it started raining out of nowhere. Even in the real world, poor Charlie Brown can't catch a break. So yeah, like I said, I can't say there's anything that was hidden that's going to shock even the most casual Peanuts fans, but it's a nice, enjoyable little bit of memorabilia that also serves as a time capsule for the Peanuts zeitgeist of the moment. And as a documentary, this also isn't fantastic, earth-shattering filmmaking. In fact, there are places where it definitely shows its age. On 2 separate occasions, the narration audio cuts out in an awkward way, making it very apparent that the line was taken from 2 separate takes, and the cut between the 2 is extremely obvious. And even the sound quality for the voice acting of the characters is pretty terrible, even by early 60s standards. But overall, it's very nice, very simple, and very humble. Unflashy and unpretentious, which has always been the appeal for Peanuts, and this documentary, if nothing else, captures that feeling oh so well. Also, here's an image of Snoopy holding a cigar. Just thought I'd bring this up. A Charlie Brown Christmas. Here it is, the one that started it all. The Peanuts' most well-known special, and one of the most famous Christmas specials of all time. Pretty much anytime you hear people talking about this special, or whether or not they like it, you'll almost always hear exactly the same thing. I like this, but I can't really explain why. And yeah, I get that. I mean, how exactly do you explain that this cartoon, with a very simple plot, very basic, borderline non-existent conflict, horribly choppy, almost broken animation, and bad line reading from kids who clearly can't read yet, is actually something truly special and one of the very best Christmas specials of all time? The crew certainly didn't think so after watching the final product for the first time. They were convinced that it would flop so badly that Peanuts would never be animated again. And yet, even after 5 decades, coming up on 6, this special has endured. And again, this begs the question, why? Just what was it about this scrappy little special? Well, I think it's for one very simple reason. There is no other Christmas special like it. I think when people think of a pure special, something that is unrestrained from typical cliches associated with Christmas, this is the one they think of. There's no story of trying to save Christmas, there's no kids trying to wait up for Santa, there's no kids wishing for a particular present, or trying to be good to get that present. It's just the story of some kids trying to put on a Christmas play. And that's it. And we don't even get to see how this play turns out. And I know it's cliche to say this about it, but it really is just unpretentious. You never for a second feel like this was something that was made because some corporate execs were checking boxes. It was made because this is what the creators wanted to make, even with the low budget and awful animation. Sincerity isn't just in every frame, it is this special's blood flow. It is what keeps it alive. In a sea of Christmas specials where, even in the good ones, you can still feel the corporate hand guiding it, that makes this one stand out all the more. Helping matters is that CBS absolutely did not want to air this at first, and only did so because they were legally obligated to do so. Another reason this stands out is because I think it really speaks more to the adults watching the special rather than the kids. I think as we get older and we see more of the crass consumerism associated with the holiday season, or even as we just get more cynical in general, the holiday just doesn't seem as magical as it once was, especially compared to when we were kids. And so I think a lot of adults relate to Charlie Brown in that regard. I know I certainly do. And it's not until Linus comes in and actually brings the entire Christmas season back into perspective by quoting from the book of Luke, reminding Charlie Brown and the audience that, oh yeah, Christmas. The true spirit of Christmas comes from the birth of Jesus, the Savior of the world, born in a quiet manger, and angels proclaiming that good news to some nearby shepherds. And since I brought up this scene, yeah, there is the incredible attention to detail of Linus dropping his security blanket after he quotes the angel saying, "Fear not." And on top of everything else with the special, it nails the characterizations. It's paced beautifully, and the jokes are mostly good. And a couple even still manage to get laughs out of me even after I've seen this one well over a few dozen times by this point. Lucy's reaction to Snoopy licking her still manages to make me laugh, as does Charlie Brown's reaction to Sally's list. I could just name all of the most iconic moments from this special, but let's face it, they're all iconic, so we'd be here all day. And then there's the music. Seriously, what can I say about this music? It's Vince Guaraldi, and this is some of his most iconic work. Linus and Lucy, Christmas Time is Here, Christmas is Coming, Skating, and a fantastic arrangement of O Tannenbaum. That man really was an incredible musician. But yeah, from top to bottom, this is the Christmas special. I really don't think you could find another special that sums up what Christmas is really about, while simultaneously mocking the bad aspects of the holiday, that comes anywhere close to this one. It is an imperfect masterpiece. And before we move on, I do need to briefly mention that the version that most of you are aware of is technically not the original version that aired. The version that most people are aware of is a patched up version in which several of the sloppier mistakes were cleaned up. Most of them are minor, like adding sound effects or musical cues where originally none existed. A handful of lines were redone, fixing some blatant continuity errors, like the snow of Lucy's psychiatry booth disappearing, or Snoopy singing along in Hark the Herald Angels Sing. But most prominently, all the references to this special originally having been sponsored by Coca-Cola are removed. And yes, it is ironic that this Christmas special that decries the prevalence of commercialism in Christmas was sponsored by a big corporation. For the most part, the edits aren't really too distracting, and I do think they actually make the product better, because I did watch the original version in its entirety, and it just feels incomplete without the sound effects that I was used to. So while I wouldn't be happy if they redid the entire thing to look cleaner and more efficient, since the bad animation and low production quality is part of its charm, at the same time, most of the cleaning up I think was a good decision. The only parts that were really distracting in that regard was that the opening and closing songs just fade out way too abruptly, and I always found that distracting even as a kid, and I feel like that could have been handled better. But yeah, that aside, there is not a thing about the patched up version that I would change. It really is just absolutely wonderful. Charlie Brown's All-Stars. Just like how A Charlie Brown Christmas captures the spirit of Christmas, this one captures the spirit of Little League Baseball. All the frustrations, the anticipation, the fears of facing a much better opponent, the joy that you might win a game, only to have that ripped away from you. With A Charlie Brown Christmas, that one was more or less just focused on telling just its one story, not really trying that hard to do the typical setup and then punchline. But this one is putting more of an emphasis on the jokes and the gags. And as a result, this one is a great deal funnier than the previous one. Now, this one's not as soulful as the previous entry, but that would be like asking for the crew to make lightning strike twice. And that being said, this one does still tell a story, with a setup, build-up, climax, and payoff. The special not only tells its own story, but it also integrates a lot of the original comic strips and brings them to the small screen. Not only that, but it also adapted 2 separate week-long story arcs from the original strip and incorporated them into this longer story really effectively. Now, there are a couple of times when you can tell, even if you haven't read the strip, that it was taken directly from the newspaper, but thankfully for the most part, they do a good job at keeping the flow moving, so it's not too distracting. The animation's not that much better compared to its predecessor, but it does look like it's not as broken as it was. Maybe due to them having a little bit more time and getting into more of a groove, or possibly having a bigger budget. But yeah, this one does still have the cheap 60s animation, but in a way that's charming in its own weird kind of way. And then this one manages to work in a surprisingly warm ending with the girls and Snoopy agreeing to make Charlie Brown a uniform as a thank you for him sticking with them. Albeit by stealing Linus's blanket, so the cynical undercurrent of this strip is still present here. Actually, now that I think about it, Linus gets the worst deal out of all the characters in the special, even more so than Charlie Brown, despite him being the one who actually has his head on his shoulders the most. I guess none of the characters are safe from getting Charlie Brown-style bad luck. Speaking of the characters, I haven't talked about them much yet, but I will say that Peanuts is one of those properties where it just gets kids. It gets the way their minds work. the way they talk, the way they're honestly really cruel to each other. This is another reason why I think Peanuts resonates so much with adults. Because we can look back at our own childhood, particularly the not-so-fun parts of it, and re-examine it with an adult lens. Probably the scene in the special that best exemplifies that is the scene where after Lucy strikes out, she seeks to blame literally everything she possibly can for her strikeout, from the bat to the ball to the sun, except herself. And like I said, even the most heartwarming thing the kids do, making Charlie Brown a uniform, is done at the expense of another kid. It really does take a master like Charles Schulz to make kids being cruel to each other funny. Now, there are some weird things about this one. Like, there's a scene of Charlie Brown trying to convince his friends to rejoin the baseball team. He gets nowhere, and then he just tries again in the next scene, and suddenly they're on board. It just didn't really feel like the first scene was necessary. And then there's Linus having the exact same reaction as the rest of the team to Charlie Brown saying they're not going to be getting uniforms, even though he already knew they weren't going to get them, and he knew why. And then there's Schroeder telling the girls that they were too mean to Charlie Brown, even though he himself participated in that cruelty as well. Wow, Schroeder, hypocrite much? But overall, this is another thoroughly delightful outing, brought to you by the crew that just gets these characters so well and manages to convey them and the strip style so effectively. Also, as a quick aside, I do not find it a coincidence that this Peanut special, in which the crux of the plot happens because the league won't accept girls, was made around the time of the women's movement. I don't really have any insightful commentary, I just wanted to make that connection. It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. You know, it really says something about Peanuts as a property, and really this animation crew in general, that not only does it have what a lot of people consider to be the definitive Christmas special, it also has what a lot of people consider to be the definitive Halloween special. I don't know what it is. There's just something that's just so admirable that this crew was able to accomplish with so much simplicity. While the animation does seem to be improving slightly with each successive special, I don't think anyone would or could call it great animation. But even still, they knew how to utilize what they had. I think what really hits the nail on the head on this one for me is just that it feels like Halloween. Every scene, every frame just tries to engulf you in a Halloween aesthetic. The orange color palette in particular gives this thing the proper autumn atmosphere. And once again, I have to give credit for proper implementation of older comic strips and inserting them into the narrative. We haven't quite reached the point where it becomes more obvious when the story stops and the strip suddenly takes over. As with the best that Peanuts has to offer, there's things to appreciate when you're a kid, like the humor, the characters, and the Halloween feel, and then there's things to appreciate when you're an adult. For example, as an adult, you might notice that this cartoon's premise is more or less a kid's version of Waiting for Godot, albeit without the references to suicide and sex. And speaking of which, the Great Pumpkin and the fact that it never does come, and that Linus is a really zealous follower of it, can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. Maybe the Great Pumpkin represents a religion, like the televangelists who swear the end of the world is coming, but it never does. Maybe it can represent a politician who keeps making grandiose claims, but they never come to pass. Or maybe it can just represent that time your dad went to go get milk, and it just seems to be taking him a long time to come back from the store. Which, given that Lucy's the one who brings Linus inside at 4 a.m. and not the parents, I'm starting to think that's what happened to both their parents. Anyway, regardless of how you want to interpret it, or even if you just want to take it at face value, Linus being such a devout follower of something that clearly does not exist, and refusing to face reality even when it's staring him in the face, is just such a funny idea. And it's also a very childlike idea that feels exactly like something a young child would do. Because as we all know, that's something that only a child would do and adults would never do. Right? And on top of all this, this one's just funny. There are so many moments that still leave me laughing, even after countless rewatches. From Schroeder playing old World War I era songs and Snoopy responds to them accordingly, from the classic football gag, which to this day remains my favorite animated version of the football gag. And in what might actually be my absolute favorite cruel moment for Charlie Brown, when he goes trick-or-treating, and somehow only manages to get a bag of rocks. This means that all the adults in the neighborhood were not only perfectly willing to give a kid a rock instead of candy for tricks or treats, but they all, whether by accident or design, all collectively gave a rock to the same kid. Like, seriously, what on earth did Charlie Brown do to make these adults hate him so much? Alright, regardless, this gag still does make me laugh a lot. Also, real quick to restore your faith in humanity, apparently after this special aired, children from all over the world felt so sorry for poor Charlie Brown that they actually mailed Charles Schulz bags of candy and told him to give it to Charlie Brown. And while we're getting into more heartwarming territory, I should note that this special does actually contain a surprisingly sweet center, and it comes from the most unlikely source, Lucy. I mean, she does try to get Linus involved in the activities. She asks the adults for extra candy while trick-or-treating so that she can give him something. And of course, as previously mentioned, she goes and retrieves him from the pumpkin patch in the early morning hours and puts him to bed. It just perfectly illustrates the bond between a sister and brother. Yes, they fight, yes, they bicker, yes, they insult, and yes, they mock, but when push comes to shove, they do care about each other. And it does show a softer side to Lucy that, honestly, we're not used to seeing, certainly not at this point in time. Combine all this, add on top of it Vince Guaraldi's excellent music, most prominently his Great Pumpkin Waltz, which is a wonderful piece that, once again, just feels like Halloween. It's excellent flow, and you've got yourself something that's pretty close to perfect. I mean, I guess I could point out some nitpicks, like this animation goof of Charlie Brown's holes disappearing, or Linus explaining to Sally how the Great Pumpkin works twice, and getting 2 separate reactions out of it, or this really out-of-date reference to the Avis Rent-A-Car slogan, but they don't in any way detract from this cartoon's awesomeness. This special is just perfect moment after perfect moment, and is, in my opinion, another imperfect masterpiece from this crew. You're in Love, Charlie Brown. This one's the weakest one so far. Now, that's not to say this one's bad. It is still really good. But this is where some of the problems that will plague some of their future outings start to become a problem. But first, let's talk about what this one gets right. As with most Peanut specials, it manages to capture a particular mood of childhood really well. In this instance, the awkwardness and embarrassment that comes from puppy love. A lot of people can relate to this one on that level alone. And the way this special takes what's ultimately a low-stakes scenario and making it feel like the most important thing in the world is done pretty well. There's also some good laughs, and we're starting to see some really funny facial expressions, which shows off some of the Looney Tunes influence that director Bill Melendez picked up from his time working on Bob Clampett's, Art Davis's, and Bob McKimson's crews. I also love this moment where Charlie Brown is trying to sneak his way back into the school after class has already started, and every single sound he makes is elevated to make it sound as noisy as possible, which again is something that I think a lot of kids can relate to. There's also a few quite amusing moments that, with the hindsight of adulthood, come across as more unintentionally funny than the creators intended. Like how in this special, Charlie Brown at times comes across as an obsessive stalker or a simp, whose every waking moment is consumed with thoughts about the little red-haired girl. That's not really a strike against the special itself, it's just something funny that I noticed. And you can tell that Charlie Brown's disdain for kindergarten cap and gown graduation was something that one of the creators, possibly Schulz himself, had happened to one of his own kids, and he found the concept just totally ridiculous. Now, like I said, this is where some of the problems of future specials start having an effect. I noted before how smoothly integrated a lot of the previous specials would insert comics into the story, but here the integration is less smooth. The pacing in this one is kinda all over the place, and the story structure is extremely vignette focused. Now, there's nothing wrong with that in and of itself, but if you're going to do that, you need to smooth out the pacing a little bit, because as is, this feels a little fractured. Not helping matters is that lines of dialogue will actively contradict things that happened previously, which kind of shows that they didn't really go back and make sure that the story stayed consistent. The most obvious example being that Lucy and Violet somehow don't know about Charlie Brown liking the little red-haired girl, even though he literally admitted it in front of the whole class just a few minutes ago. And then there's some other weird things, like Peppermint Patty just assuming that the girl that Charlie Brown's talking about having a crush on is Lucy, for no reason that I can think of. Like, I know she can be a little absent-minded, but that felt really forced. Maybe if this was done out of sabotage, like because she's in love with Charlie Brown, okay, that would make sense. But there is absolutely nothing in the special to indicate that's why she did it. They're portraying it as if she'd simply made some kind of a mistake, which would make sense considering by this point in the comic history, I don't believe they'd established her crush on Charlie Brown yet. Also, on a smaller note, the color palette of this shot is a genuine eyesore. I don't know who signed off on it, but it is a pain to look at. And then there's the bit of Charlie Brown yelling at the teacher. It kinda does come out of nowhere. I get it's supposed to show that he's getting frustrated, but it still feels out of character. Maybe if the teacher was trying to talk over him or something, it would be a lot easier to swallow, but that part felt a little jarring to me. Now, with all that being said, I don't want you to walk away from this review thinking that I disliked it. I do genuinely enjoy the special. It may not have quite the emotional pull of their previous 3 specials, but it is really good, and of course features these characters that we all know and love being brought to life. And of course, the fact that we don't see the little red-haired girl, just like in the comics, creates a level of separation between her and the audience. Much like Charlie Brown, we don't really get to know her as a character, because he's too scared to talk to her and actually get to know her. And for those people that criticize the Peanuts movie for having a happy ending, this special is proof that Charles Schulz didn't necessarily have a problem with Charlie Brown being given a happy ending with regards to the little red-haired girl. In fact, when I initially saw this note, I actually thought this was going to be revealed as a cruel prank by Lucy or something, but it wasn't. Although, who on earth would sign their own name as little red-haired girl? I'm probably overthinking it. Anyway, this one's really good. And if you're itching for a Charlie Brown special from the OG crew and want something a little bit more obscure, it's definitely worth giving a watch. And if you're looking for a pointless little bit of trivia, this special marks the first time the trombone was used as a substitute for adults talking. And yeah, it's a clever way to signify to the audience that the adults are speaking to the kids, but without giving the adults any kind of presence in order to stay true to the original strip. He's your dog, Charlie Brown. After being relegated to a supporting role in the first 4 specials, here we get a special where Snoopy is at the front and center, and the results are admittedly not great. This is the first special that I do have some significant issues with. Certainly not enough to make it unwatchable, but enough that it gives me genuine pause. Now, some of what makes the original Peanuts shorts charming is still in here. There are a few funny jokes. I don't know why, but the joke of Snoopy throwing a rock like it's a grenade at Linus got a genuine laugh out of me. The final fight between Snoopy and Lucy was fun, along with the implication that Lucy does genuinely seem to enjoy her love-hate relationship with Snoopy. As was the kinda out-of-nowhere fight between Snoopy and Peppermint Patty. And yeah, it is kinda nice and heartwarming to see all the neighborhood kids want Snoopy to come back. And the scenes of Charlie Brown and Snoopy reuniting are genuinely sweet. And another thing to appreciate about it, as has been the case, they keep slowly improving on the animation. I mean, obviously, this is still stiff TV quality animation, but I do like that they seem to be getting more comfortable and are improving in their quality of their work. But, with all that being said, I just don't think this is a plot that can sustain a full 25-minute runtime. This can be felt in scenes that just drag. Like the bit of Peppermint Patty bringing Snoopy drinks goes on for too long. The bit of Snoopy cleaning Peppermint Patty's house also goes on for too long. And then there's the opening bit that literally recycles animation from It's the Great Pumpkin Charlie Brown. And trust me, we remember that special. The story as is could maybe work as an 11 to 15 minute story. The rest of the 10 minutes is pretty much just filler. And that's not even getting into some of the other problems. Like Peppermint Patty just not calling Charlie Brown to complain about Snoopy's bad behavior for over a week, which is just really out of character for her. Or how Charlie Brown just guesses that Snoopy went back to Peppermint Patty's house. Like, did he know that he was there the whole time? If he did, why didn't he go back earlier, especially if he apparently missed him? It's moments like these that really make me question whether or not the script for this went beyond a first draft. And then there's probably the most jarring thing about this entire thing, and that's Snoopy's characterization. Snoopy is, how can I put this delicately, a real SOB in this special, literally and figuratively. I get that Snoopy is supposed to be kind of a jerk, but I think they went above and beyond to make him worse than usual, and went too far with it. Now, I understand thematically why they did this. They wanted him to be worse so that the kids would have a reason to complain to Charlie Brown. But even if you're going to make Snoopy worse than normal, you need to actually make sure that he has a reason for doing what he's doing. For instance, what purpose was there in him just kicking Schroeder here? Schroeder didn't say anything to him, do anything to him, and Snoopy wasn't even in the middle of some kind of fantasy, and he doesn't gain anything out of it. He just did it for no reason. I'm not saying you always need to have a good reason for Snoopy to act like a jerk, but a reason, any reason at all, would help. Otherwise, why am I supposed to sympathize with him when Peppermint Patty takes him in and forces him to do all the housework? I just do not understand what this special is trying to do. Peanuts tended to be at its best when it tapped into something from our childhoods and viewed it from an adult lens. All the specials before this had managed to do so. But what exactly is this special trying to tap into? What exactly is it trying to accomplish? Like, is the point supposed to be don't put your dog on a leash? Is it supposed to be that you should just accept someone's flaws without question and have no expectation for them to get better? I mean, if this was supposed to be just a funny story, I could accept that. But I don't even think this was trying to be that funny because there's not really a lot of jokes in this one. It feels like they were trying to tell a more serious story. And it genuinely doesn't help that Snoopy Come Home would be released 4 years later and would do the same basic setup, like, a lot better. Again, it's not like this is atrocious or anything. It is competent and watchable, but it is profoundly disappointing when you consider what preceded it. It was a short summer, Charlie Brown. Boy, you think summers are short when you're a kid? Just wait until you're an adult. Anyway, this special is significant for a number of reasons. For starters, this is the first special in which the majority of the voice acting cast that had been in these specials since A Charlie Brown Christmas had been replaced. And even then, this special would be Peter Robbins' final performance of the character of Charlie Brown before he also grew out of it. This was also the first Peanuts special to not be nominated for a Primetime Emmy. And it was the final special released in the 60s. So I don't think it's a stretch to say that this feels like something of a transition special. And you can also kind of tell with regards to the way this is structured and the pacing of it. Just like the last one, the pacing in this one is kind of a mess. It jumps around a lot with some scenes going on too long, like this back and forth between Charlie Brown and Linus, in which they repeat the phrase, teachers spend 4 years of their life at college, like 3 separate times. And others going by too quickly, like the softball game that we only get to hear about but not actually see. But with all that being said, this one succeeds in a way the previous one didn't, and that this one's just funnier. This one's got good laughs, good reactions, and some moments that are just pathetic, like when the boys and girls are both engaged in a swimming contest, and the boys are so pitiful that they actually look like they're legitimately drowning. This one does kind of go with the typical boys versus girls plot that has honestly been done before a lot, wherein the boys go in super confident because obviously boys are better than girls, only for them to get pounded into the dust by the girls in every single competition. It's not a cliche I'm terribly fond of because of how predictable it is, but given this was made back in the 60s, back when the cliche was a little more new, I'm willing to cut it some slack. Especially considering it does really fit nicely into the Peanuts formula, particularly that nothing can really go right for Charlie Brown. This one also nails Snoopy's personality a lot better than the previous one. Whereas in that one, he was just kind of a reprobate for no reason. Here, I think they found that balance of, yes, making him kind of thoughtless, but more in an entertaining way. And even then, he does wind up trying to help the boys later on in the special. So his actions here are way more forgivable. And yeah, this one does try its hand at capturing just how thoroughly miserable going to camp can be. In my opinion, Race for Your Life Charlie Brown would do this a little bit better, but this was a good early attempt at capturing that feeling. There are a few weird things about this one. Like I said, the pacing in this one's a little wonky. There are some downright bizarre plot beats, like how Lucy was somehow able to sign up all the boys to go to camp, even though that doesn't make any sense. The main storyline ends kind of abruptly, and while the animation continues to improve a little bit compared to its previous outing, there was this really bizarre and blatant animation error where Linus and Schroeder's shirts swapped colors. But overall, this one's enjoyable. This one doesn't really have any real pathos about itself, but I don't think it's really supposed to. It's just a nice, pleasant, if flawed, outing with these characters. Play It Again, Charlie Brown. I can spell out exactly what the problem with this special is in one sentence. You could cut out half this cartoon and you wouldn't lose a thing. Seriously, what is up with this cartoon's pacing? Now, the Peanut specials do tend to have slower pacing. That is part of their low-key charm after all. But the entire pacing of this special just feels off. There are long segments of nothing happening. From Schroeder just playing the piano to watching characters play music or dance to music. Now, it's good music, but the visuals that we're looking at while the music is playing just is not interesting. It's just the same boring, bland camera angle without much deviation. Not only that, but the pacing sometimes kills the momentum for several of the jokes they're trying to tell. One time it actually ruined a joke from the original comic strip by actually showing us the preceding events leading up to it, which ruins the surprise and therefore the punchline. Another time it took Lucy well over 5 seconds to actually complete the punchline for one of the jokes. And it was so delayed that it actually took me a second to realize that that was even supposed to be a punchline. The first half in particular is like that. Schroeder plays the piano, Lucy tries to get Schroeder to like him, he ignores her, she complains to someone about it, and then she goes back and tries again. It gets tired after a while. And then suddenly in the second half, the special suddenly remembers, oh yeah, we need to have some kind of conflict. So then they do this kind of thing where Lucy gives Schroeder the opportunity to play his piano at a PTA meeting, and he agrees, and then suddenly he gets told that he can't play Beethoven music like he'd been told that he could, and he'll have to play rock and roll instead. And when he tries to back out of it, Charlie Brown, Snoopy, and Pigpen try to guilt trip Schroeder into doing it anyway because they want to perform right alongside him, even though Schroeder never even told them that they could play alongside him. In fact, just the opposite. He told them no. So why are they the ones treating Schroeder like he's the bad guy for backing out of it and disappointing his friends? This is not logical. And I know, they're kids, and kids can be selfish, but this is a story, and the characters' actions need to make some semblance of sense. It needs to be internally coherent, and this isn't. Oh, and then there's the really stupid ending where after Schroeder decides that he can't go through with it, Lucy's solution to give the adults at the PTA meeting a show is to just use PTA entertainment in a spray can. Yeah, doing it as a quick gag earlier in the special is okay, but using something this fantastical and out there as an actual plot point feels off. It doesn't feel like Peanuts at all. Like it was something that was made up at the last second to try to wrap everything up quickly. So yeah, as you can tell, I had a lot of issues with this one. I don't know what happened here. Maybe the crew was too busy focusing on Snoopy Come Home, or maybe Schultz was suffering too much from his ongoing divorce at the time, and therefore didn't have much time to work on this. I don't know. But whatever the reason, this just didn't do much for me. I mean, again, it's not like this is actively terrible. It's just very dull and boring and forgettable. Which is a shame because underneath all of this, there is the potential for a story all about changing taste in music, how they evolve, and the importance of not selling out. But that's of little consolation when the rest of the special is just so boring. The only part of the special that I actually kind of liked was the bit where Lucy is talking to her empty psychiatrist booth, and Snoopy comes up and decides to just take her place. And then after giving Lucy a piece of advice, actually ask her for a nickel. That is such a great moment. You're Not Elected, Charlie Brown. This one, I think, is far more clever than a lot of people give it credit for. On the surface, this is just a special about Linus running for student body president that was made simply to coincide with the 1972 US presidential election between Richard Nixon and George McGovern. But there's actually a lot of subtext and political commentary seamlessly interweaved into its narrative. For instance, the scene where Linus is put on the radio to answer the questions that voters may have, but it proves to be completely unproductive due to the incompetence of the voters. Then there's the one kid who says that he'd vote for Linus because he gave him half of his peanut butter sandwich one time. Perhaps a subtle commentary about voters who vote for candidates because they think it'll benefit themselves personally. Or Lucy threatening people into voting in a poll the way she wants them to, which is actually not only in a roundabout way kinda sweet that she's actually willing to threaten people for the sake of her brother, but also how things like societal pressure can influence polls, which can therefore influence election results. And then there's Linus being asked to give a statement to the school paper, and he refuses to keep his answer and vision succinct, so the paper neuters his words to a streamlined level. And then there's the infamous moment where Linus decides to spread the good news about the truth of the Great Pumpkin to his constituents, and that one singular mistake very nearly sinks his entire campaign. All that hard work at maintaining his good, clean image, gone in a single moment. Actually, if anything, Peanuts was probably too optimistic about politics with this commentary in particular. But by far the most obvious piece of commentary is that once Linus is elected, he suddenly realizes upon speaking to the principal that his power is actually far more limited than he thought, and he won't be able to keep all the promises that he made to get himself elected. And I actually like how the ending actually brings this entire thing full circle, and has it tie into what is ultimately the core message of this special. Because the special starts out with a subplot about Sally complaining that she can't get her locker open, and so she turns to a candidate, in this case Linus, to take care of the problem for her, but when Linus has, in her words, sold them out, she then proceeds to kick her locker, which causes it to open. The message I took away from this, and I don't think this was unintentional, is don't rely on politicians to solve all your problems. Work on solving them yourselves if you can. Just because your guy is in office, that's not going to magically fix everything. And on top of all this, even just as a special in and of itself, it's great. The jokes are funny, with even the voice acting getting some laughs. The one joke in particular that stands out to me, especially as an adult, is the moment when Linus says that he'll release us from our spiritual Babylon and bring down the false idols in high places. And Schroeder can't help but notice that the principal has gone pale at that line. The pacing is stellar. The story, which was initially adapted from a story arc in the comics, is adapted flawlessly, with strips seamlessly weaved into a flowing narrative. Even when there are scenes that, in the grand scheme of things, don't really affect the narrative, like the Joe Cool musical number, or the scene of Sally showing off Charlie Brown for show and tell, even though those are technically filler, the scenes are funny and entertaining enough that they weirdly don't feel out of place. And of course, this special contains the cartoon debut of Woodstock. And yeah, he's a fun character, even for as little as we see of him here. Snoopy's character in these specials just feels incomplete when he doesn't have Woodstock by his side, when he doesn't have someone to bounce reactions off of. Now, it's not completely perfect. For instance, at one point when they're checking to see if Charlie Brown could be a good candidate for student body president, Lucy says she'll run some polling, and then returns 5 seconds later saying that she has the results of the poll and that he won't be elected, and then sometime later tells him the exact same results of the poll as if it's news to him. And then when the votes are being tallied, the animation on Schroeder and Violet doesn't match what Charlie Brown is saying. But yeah, overall, a really great Peanuts special, and one that I don't think gets brought up nearly enough as one of their greats, but it's earned. All I have to say is that I'm so glad that the kids who watched this special way back in the day took this cartoon's message about not relying on politicians to solve all their problems because they'll inevitably disappoint you to heart, and don't deify candidates to such an absurd, horribly detrimental degree, which is why our current political system is healthy and totally not completely broken at all. There's no time for love, Charlie Brown. There's not really a ton to say about this one other than it's nice and pleasant, it captures the spirit of Peanuts quite well, It's funny, but the pacing is pretty erratic and kinda all over the place, with some parts feeling more like a greatest hits reel of Charles Schulz's favorite comic strips rather than a flowing narrative. In fact, I don't even know why the special has the name that it does when love doesn't really factor into its narrative until the third act. The first 8 minutes of this cartoon actually feels more like an indictment of the public education system than having anything to do with the title. But then it kind of settles into a groove with the field trip plot, and even working in some pot shots at modern art for good measure. Not just in Linus and Lucy's experience at the actual museum, but also in the other kids mistaking a grocery store display for a postmodernist art sculpture. That's something that's only gotten even more believable since the time the special has aired. Then the special kind of addresses that Peppermint Patty and Marcy having a crush on Charlie Brown that, at least in these specials, hadn't really been addressed before. Although not much really comes of it. Also, I just realized that when you get down to it, nothing really that bad happened to Charlie Brown in the special. He ended up getting a kiss from Marcy, and an A on his report from the entire ordeal. Once again, I am reminding people that while Charlie Brown does lose a lot, even in the early days they knew they needed to have him win every once in a while in order to keep things fresh. I really wish I had more to say about it, but when you get down to it, this is just watching the Peanuts characters be the Peanuts characters in a little bit of slice of life for about 25 minutes. It's nothing spectacular or earth-shattering or even really that deep, but it's a fine special, and one that I think tends to get overlooked because of that. And by the way, for those of you that were curious, even though I know that nobody is, the solution to the math problem that Linus reads to Lucy at the start of the special, the answer is 41. Yeah, I know, no one cares, but I spent time working on it to get the answer, and by golly, I was going to fit it in here somewhere. A Charlie Brown Thanksgiving. So after making the definitive Christmas and Halloween specials, Peanuts just couldn't leave well enough alone. They had to try to go for the trifecta and work to make the definitive Thanksgiving special, although admittedly they didn't exactly have much competition, especially back then. I'd say they held onto that title admirably for 14 years. Yeah, this is no Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, but honestly, what is? Anyway, just like the other Peanut specials, the stakes are very low, the plot is extremely simplistic, and this one seems content at just capturing a mood. And while yes, this one's not as masterful as the holiday specials that preceded it, this is still really good. The plot of Charlie Brown being forced to prepare a Thanksgiving Day meal is actually kind of ingenious when you think about it, as the kids can relate to Snoopy's funny antics, but adults can relate to the chaos of trying to get everything cleaned, set up, and all the food being made. But speaking of Snoopy's antics, I don't think you can talk about this special without talking about what everyone remembers from this special, and that's his fight with the chair. Sure, it technically doesn't impact the plot, but man, does this fight come out of nowhere, and man, is it enjoyable. And I guess I should mention that for some reason, my favorite joke has always been when Woodstock accidentally toasts Snoopy's ear. The look on Snoopy's face while it's happening is just priceless. And then there's the ending punchline to the entire special, and that's that Snoopy could have made a proper Thanksgiving for the kids from the start. He just actively chose not to. And as a side note, watching Snoopy and Woodstock bond together over a Thanksgiving meal just makes for a real heartwarming scene. Even if Woodstock is eating a bird, and he's also a bird. I'm overthinking it again. Anyway, this plot is simplistic even by the standards of Peanuts. Peppermint Patty invites herself, Marcy, and Franklin over to Charlie Brown's house for Thanksgiving. Yeah, it's completely in character for her to do something like this, although this does kind of open up a can of worms about what all these kids' family life is like if they can just abandon their families to spend Thanksgiving with their friends. But anyway, that simplicity is part of the charm. Although admittedly there are a few scenes where the pacing's not completely on point, but above all, this is a nice little tale about appreciating what you have and what you're given, even if it's not quite what you expected. Yeah, when compared to A Charlie Brown Christmas and Great Pumpkin, this is a downgrade, but this is still a more than worthy holiday special. And it just puts you in the Thanksgiving mood. Also, something mentioned this scene of Franklin being given the crappy chair. Yeah, somehow Twitter keeps rediscovering this scene year after year and try to perceive it as Charles Schulz being racist and not just, a funny joke. Guys, this is not proof of anything. Calm down. Alright, I think we'll stop there for now. 10 specials. 10, that's a nice round number. Just as round as Charlie Brown's head. But yeah, this was mostly a really strong collection of specials. There were, of course, the 3 classic holiday specials, and I felt they more than lived up to their reputations. Although granted, it could be because I grew up with them. And I was struck upon rewatching some of these, just how adult particular elements of it were. You're Not Elected Charlie Brown in particular plays a lot more to the adults than to the kids watching. But of course, not every special was perfect. Almost no run of cartoons or specials are. In fact, they actually kinda hit something of a slump for a while. And like I said, I don't think it's a coincidence that the worst one so far, Play It Again Charlie Brown, was made while Snoopy Come Home was being made and while Schultz was going through his divorce. There's just something about that special that just doesn't feel right. And yeah, the animation did improve as time went on. Which I would hope so. I would hope the budgets would be higher and the crew would get into more of a groove as time went on. And I also gotta admire Schultz's dedication to using real kids to voice the Peanuts characters. Even though there are moments where you can tell the kids do not understand the lines they're saying, it kinda adds a level of authenticity that real kids are the ones speaking. Overall, these specials have a charm to them, one that's really difficult to capture. But as time goes on, we'll be able to see if they're able to hold on to that charm. So next time, we'll be taking a look at some more holiday specials like the Easter and Valentine's Day one, as well as one of the more infamous specials, It's Your First Kiss, Charlie Brown. That one's going to be a really fun one to dissect. And I guess that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to be notified of when part 2 comes out, make sure that you're subscribed so that you don't miss it. Anyway, have a good day, and I'll see you next time.